Hi everybody. In this via render video, we want to take a look at render passes. We're going to look primarily at D5 render passes and how you can bring those into Photoshop to improve your final renders. Now, this is a beginner-focused tutorial, so if you're already familiar with render passes, this might not be the video for you. But if you're just starting out in 3D or starting out in rendering and you're not familiar with the concept, hopefully this video will get you up and running. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, everybody. So here we are in our quick sort of D5 test scene. You can see it's a pretty basic setup. We've got some artwork on the walls, some wood table, and some decorative elements. In D5, you'll access all but the Z depth pass from the actual render settings. So I'm going to go here to image, click on that, and you can see we have the option for render channels. Okay. And to enable these, you do, I believe, have to be using the Pro version of D5, and I believe you need to enable the Render Pass widget. So that'll be under Preferences. So up here, Preferences, and just enable those. Now, I'm going to toggle these on, and I'm going to click the little icon here, and we'll take a look at what we've got. So the Sky Mask will allow you to, in Photoshop, select the actual sky. Now, this would be very useful if, for example, you've got a really nice render, but perhaps you want to change the environment to maybe a brighter sky. Now, you might want to do this if you're doing a lot of real estate or residential or commercial rendering, and oftentimes they don't really want a dramatic sky. They might want just something that's pure blue. And if you didn't use maybe a pure blue HDRI in D5, you may find it really useful to be able to change the sky. All right, the AO layer is the ambient occlusion layer. And if you're not familiar with this term, ambient occlusion is effectively when you get contact shadows. As light bounces around, it's not going to go into the darker areas, basically the nooks and crannies of your scene. And so you're going to get shadowing in those areas. An example of this would be right here. You can see just under the bowl, we've got this pretty lovely contact shadow. It looks nice. And that's really going to show up in our ambient occlusion render. Now, on top of that, we have the Material ID. Now, the Material ID will allow you in Photoshop to select individual Material ID channels. Now, we'll look at this in Photoshop, but this is very useful. For example, if you have an image like this, and you want to ensure that the red of these metallic leaves really pops, and perhaps you want it to pop even more than the natural lighting would let it, you can select these using the Material ID in Photoshop, and that will actually allow you to crank the values for a specific effectively channel, which is really just, if you think of colors in Photoshop as different channels. So what you're doing is being able to select that individual channel, mostly because the Material ID will have a unique color assigned. Now, that will make probably a little bit more sense when we hop into Photoshop. Lastly, we have the reflection, which is exactly what it sounds like, and we'll get a good example of this here. These are going to be these nice shiny reflections that will show up, and we will be able to use a blend mode in Photoshop to really crank up those reflections. The last two will be transparency, not something we'll really do a huge amount with in this video. In fact, not really something I've used a huge amount at all, full stop. And lastly, the Z depth. Okay, in order to show you the Z depth, I'm going to move myself out of the way here. And we mentioned at the start that Z depth is not done from a camera basis in D5. So let's hop out of the actual camera settings. And I'm going to click on scene 1 just so I get my camera back here. Going back to the stored camera, that's scene up here in the top left. And then I'm going to go over here to effect, and we'll look at Z depth. Now, this was kind of a big deal, and I might just do a full video on this on Z depth in a little bit. But at its most basic, we're going to use Z depth to add depth of field. So depth of field is any iPhone users who've used the portrait mode in their camera. What is happening is the iPhone is basically putting the subject, which is usually a person's face or maybe some food or something like that on the table, in focus while everything else gets blurred out. Now, Z depth is a way that in D5 that we can manually set this. So looking at this image right now, The dark areas are going to be basically in focus, and the whiter areas will be out of focus. Now, please note that if you don't set this up correctly, if, for example, maybe you have the white areas really close to the camera, the dark areas at the back, basically inverted, we can always fix that in Photoshop as well. It's not a big deal. Really, though, what you're going for is, if you think of it as near to the camera, medium distance, and far away. And so the black right now will be the closest to the camera in terms of the visual clarity. Then the grays are going to be medium, and then the light, what is white right now on the screen, will be the areas that are the most blurred or out of focus. And you've kind of got a bit of control over this. I'm honestly not in love with how the developers of D5 integrated this. There's, please don't jump down my throat for that one. I think there's a little bit of a control issue here where you're trying to get exactly the result you're going for. And I'm not entirely sure if just tweaking these minuscule sliders is maybe the way to go. All right, everybody. So here we are in Photoshop, and you can see we've got the what's referred to as the raw render, which is usually the first one that came out, and that's sitting at the top of our layer stack. Underneath that, we have the AO, Material ID, Reflection, and so forth and so forth. Now, we should also point out, if you want to get your render passes into a single Photoshop layer stack, instead of loading them up individually and then copying and pasting, just go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and it'll ask you which ones you want to grab, and it will just auto-load them for you. It's a much faster way to go about doing this. All right, now with our render passes done, it's time to start setting up this in the right order and basically utilizing these to the best of our ability. Now, I kind of had to learn this back when I was doing stuff with some ZBrush stuff, way back when I first started out doing 3D work. And a lot of people who did ZBrush work for concept art would be familiar with the idea of rendering out ZBrush layer passes using different, what was at the time, the original sort of matte cap materials. These were the material captures in ZBrush. And what you would do is effectively like render out like a whole bunch of these, bring them into Photoshop and utilize different color information from each of the different renders to build up some, you know, kind of portraiture or concept art or something like that. Now, some people come at this from a slightly different way. I think V-Ray also can, and I think probably a whole bunch of other render engines do let you render out render passes. So, you know, I'm going to approach this the way I learned it. It might not be the perfect way or the best way, but it's sort of what I use, and hopefully if you're just starting out, it'll be really good for you too. All right, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit as well here. Okay, here's our default render passes, and I'm going to right-click and duplicate this layer. This is just good habit, full stop. All right, that looks good. And the first layer we're going to work with is the AO layer. So I'm going to left-click on this guy, drag it all the way to the top of the stack. And you can see, interestingly, the glass is not showing up in the AO layer. That's kind of curious, but there we go. All right, toggle this on and off. Now, in order to best utilize the render passes, you need to understand the concept of screen modes. At its most basic, where it says normal here, we can adjust this and put them into basic screen or blend modes. Now, this is not new to Photoshop in any way at all. It's been used for quite a long time now. And what we want to do is grab really the pixel information of each of these render passes and apply it to the layer below, which is right now this one here, the duplicate. And so by doing that, we can add more, effectively more pixel information, both more depth, more shadows, and more highlights. So for the AO layer, I'm going to change the blend mode of this, and you can see right here we've got the darken multiplied. One loose way to think of the blend modes in Photoshop is they're either darkening or lightening, or to some way additive. So for our purpose here, you could put this on like multiply and kind of drop all this really low down, but you can kind of see it's going to kind of darken pretty much everything universally. So what we can do is in fact bring this to overlay. Now here in overlay, what we're getting is really the darkest parts are going to be basically projected downwards onto this layer right here. Now you can still see on overlay, it's pretty strong. In fact, it might be a little bit too strong. So we can go here and just drop the opacity down. And hopefully what we're going for this is kind of just adding in some darkness back into the image, especially if we look at these shadow areas here. So you can see off, on, off, and on. I'm going to strengthen this just a little bit here. There we go. Looks nice. And zoom back out just a little bit. Now, one thing I do like to do with these is if I put this at overlay, we can also right click and duplicate this darken or AO layer again. And I'm going to, again, put this back to 100% here. And we can spin through the blend modes using the down arrow key. So I'm just going to find one other additional way we can use the AO layer is to go up here, right click, duplicate it again. I'm going to put this fella back to 100% just so we can see. And instead of using overlay, let's look at soft light. Now, soft light is a blend mode equivalent of using the burn and dodge tools. It'll kind of slightly lighten up some areas, but darken the darker areas as well. And you can see it just slightly adjusts the color, but it's at a very strong opacity. So let's drop that quite low. All right, if we toggle these on and off, here is our raw render. Looks like that. And then with our two darkening blend modes put on, I think overall we're getting some nice, more dramatic shadows. Now, again, this probably isn't going to work for every scene. And you do have to kind of be mindful of that. But overall, it's a pretty good starting point. All right. In order to show you reflections, I had intended to just use our reflection blend mode here. But you can see there's not a huge amount that's reflective in this shot. So let's look at a different shot. All right. So here we have an interior D5 ultra luxury modern scene. It's the type you kind of see quite a lot on the D5 forums and on the Facebook group. And, overall, it's a great show off of the shininess of D5 materials. It's not my thing, but people seem to really like this. Anyway, one thing that is cool about this, if we look at the reflection pass that came out of this shot, you can see we've got a lot more visual information to work with. We've got reflective surfaces, and we've got kind of reflective marble showing up on the statue as well. So how do we use this? Well, in a situation like this, we would do something similar. We're going to change the blend mode from normal to either lighten or screen. Now, how I generally use this is I'm going to put this on screen, and I'm going to drop this down to 50%. Now, you may have to mask off certain areas. One sort of issue with the reflection render pass is it sometimes will pick up stuff you don't really want to be excessively shiny. And so you may have to come in, for example, let's take a look at just the statue right here. Say, for example, that you're getting a very bright highlight just on the left. We can always come down here and paint in a mask. So I'm going to hit just a mask. And I'm going to hit B on the keyboard, grab a paintbrush, change this to black, and start brushing out the reflection right here. Now, all in all, though, I think this still looks pretty good. We look at some of the shinier objects. We can turn the blend mode for screen off and on, off and on. And again, you may, for example, find that you want to bring back those shadows. Just use your mask to paint these sort of areas where you get a bit more occlusion back in. Now, the other option we can do is I'm going to right click and duplicate this one more time. And on this duplicate, we'll delete the layer mask. We don't need that. And I'm going to put this back to 100 for everyone. Zoom out. And instead of using lighten, we're going to use, instead of using screen, we'll use lighten. And so both of these will kind of work in an additive fashion. You're adding in reflections. So you can also adjust the layer order for these. But all in all, I think our screen and lighten blend modes are looking pretty good. And that's really how to use the reflection pass in D5. One technique I have found useful is to put both of these at about 50%. That way you get a nice blend between the lightning effect and the screen effect. And I think all in all, it kind of works really, really well. So that's what we do with our reflection pass. Continuing on, everybody. Also, if you've made it this far to the video, thank you so much for watching. Really do appreciate it. I hope you're finding the content useful. we're going to continue with our render passes. But again, thank you so much for watching. Really do appreciate it. So here's the render pass material ID layer. Sometimes actually called a clown pass back in the day as well. But this will actually allow us to make selections to specific parts. First thing I'm going to do is hit W on my keyboard, and I'm going to select the actual table here. Now, you do want to get off of the material ID layer when you do this, and we need to go back to the actual layer that we're going to work on. So I do recommend that, again, you right-click and duplicate your merged or grouped background layer, which is now this one. Now that I've made my selection from this guy, here we go, I can make my changes to this one. So what I'm going to do for this is bring back some of the vibrance on the table. So I'm going to move my layers palette here, go down to the adjustments, and I'm going to click on vibrance. And you can see, because we had that selection going, and when we created our adjustment layer, you can see that it has masked off everything we don't want selected. And now if I make adjustments, for example, to the vibrance here, you can really crank up, bring back the oranges into that table. Or you could alternatively strip them out if you want a more desaturated, kind of washed out photo. Depends on kind of the look you're going for. And I'll bring this back a little bit. Looks good. And then the next thing I'm going to do is go back to the material ID or render pass there. I'm going to click W again, grab the magic wand tool. And you do want to make sure that when you're using the magic wand tool for this, generally speaking, contiguous, you'll have to be careful about whether contiguous is on or off. Contiguous is basically whether it grabs all of a particular color in an image, whether it's connected or not. If contiguous is turned on, it will only sort of select the pixels of that particular color that are actually touching. So just be mindful of that. So hit W on the keyboard, select that background. All right. Go back here to this guy, and I'm going to go to my adjustment layer, and I'm going to go to brightness and contrast. And I'm going to bring some brightness back into that background. And you can see I can crank it a little bit here, or we can take it away and try and get some of that brightness going on. Now, you will notice sort of that I'm actually getting some of the pixels here as well. And as such, it is lightening up a little bit of the plant as well. But overall, still pretty happy with the end result of that. I think it looks pretty happy with it. All right, everybody, moving on to the Z depth layer. So there's a couple of different ways we can utilize this. I'm going to show you two ways that I wouldn't know how to use this. There's probably like dozens of ways to do this, and there's lots of different ways to do everything in Photoshop. So I'm just going to show you the ways that I would maybe utilize this. The first is pretty basic. I am going to add some sort of pseudo or fake depth of field to my image. So this is this Vibrance 1 copy. I'm just going to double click here, rename it, and I use the naming convention background BKG. Not sure why. Anyway, we have this guy. I'm going to right click and I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to make sure it says BKG copy, background copy. We go filter, blur, and Gaussian blur. And you can use any blur method you really want, but I'm really going to crank this up just so we get like a super pronounced depth of field. Click OK. And in order to mask this out, I am going to add a mask, and I'm going to go to the rendered Z-depth layer. I'm going to do Control A, Control C to copy, and then I'm going to Alt click on the mask and do Control V to paste this in. Okay, now you'll notice a couple of things. We toggle the blur on and off. You are getting the effect. Let's zoom in here. You can kind of see it here a little bit. Off, on, off, on. But one issue is that this mask just doesn't have the brights and dark values that we're going for. And so what we need to do is go back to the render depth pass here. And I'm going to, again, just disable this fellow here. All right, and I'm going to go to... What I will actually do is make a quick duplicate of this really quickly and move our duplicate down out of the way. So here we go. We're going to go then adjustments and levels. And what we need to do is make sure there's quite a range of lights and darks in this. So in other words, we need to make sure that the white parts are more pronouncedly white and the dark parts are actually going to be darker. All right, that looks nice. A little bit more on the light. And the grays, that looks good. All right, brilliant. Okay, again, I'm going to right-click and merge that down. And again, Control A to copy, Control C to copy. I'm sorry, Control A, select all, Control C to copy. Alt clicking on this mask and Control V to paste that in. And now you can kind of see how much more pronounced that the field actually is. We can toggle this guy on and off, and you're really, really getting a blur. Now, one sort of issue that you're going to get with this is really that, you know, if we zoom in a little bit here, you're not entirely going to get perfect mask here. You might find that there's a bit of a discrepancy. You're getting this sort of blurring effect, or it's almost kind of like a bloom effect around the outer edges. Now, you could possibly go in and refine this as much as you want, but you know, it's just one way to get a really quick depth of field in your shot. And if you go into, let's say we select both of these guys and we do a little bit more like camera raw on them. For example, we merge these guys down. We could go filter, we could do lens correction, and we could actually add in a little bit of chromatic aberration. And you can kind of see that around the edges now. I think that will really, really help as well. And click OK. All right, so that's one way to potentially use this. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Oh, by the way, you can also adjust the opacity and strength of this layer. This is effectively just a super blurry layer. That's all it is. Now, the blur is quite pronounced because we made it quite pronounced, but ultimately you got kind of control over that. All right, let's move on. All right, everybody, on to the last bit. The second way to use the Z-depth pass, and by the way, if I alt-click on this guy here, you can see this is the slightly modified Z-depth pass that I did. It's a blend of the original one from D5 and the duplicate that I put in Photoshop, and kind of just tweak the values a little bit. So, okay, so how we're going to use this in this alternative one, and this is probably the mode that gives you the most control, is I have again duplicated my background copy and I've applied this guy as a mask. You can also go here to your channels and place it into the alpha channel. So all you have to do is just kind of click here, add an alpha channel. Either one is completely fine, but I kind of like using them. I just prefer using masks. So again, I add my mask here, alt click on it and Control V and paste that little fella in there. Okay, that looks good. And you can see it shows up right here in the channels as well. All right, so what we're going to do now, these are duplicates, one with a mask, one without. And you go to the top one, we're going to go filter, blur, and lens blur. Now, I don't know enough about photography to know exactly sort of like what this is really duplicating, so here goes. So what we're going to do is basically increase the radius first, which will set the maximum amount of blur. And we're going to use in this case, our layer mask. You could also use alpha 1 or layer mask. I'm using the layer mask as a mask to block out the effect. So I'm going to crank up the radius here, and we're going to take this blur like up to 100. And you can see, wow, super, super bright and blurry. Now, one issue is we might perhaps have to invert this. So I'm going to click here to see. And you can see, nope, it's not an issue of inversion. It might just be an issue of the actual focal distance. And so we can tweak this slider here and take it to the left to get the result we're going for. And I think that looks pretty nice. We also have some options here. For example, the blade curvature and rotation will also affect really the look and feel of this effectively very, very strong lens blur. Now, I'm not familiar enough with these to know exactly what they're doing. I think there's some really good YouTube videos out there from actual like photographers. Now, the one we do want to look at is maybe the specular highlights, and I think rotation here is iris rotation. I haven't got a clue actually what that does. So just crank the sliders to see what happens. Now, the hexagon shape, though, will actually determine the overall kind of shape of the depth of field that is applied to your image. You'd really see this if you put it on the triangle one. Might be a little hard for you guys to see, but my understanding is that it will create effectively a triangular depth of field effect. Now, I'm not sure if the layer mask overrides that per se, but generally I found you can leave this on 6 without any real problem. Now, the other thing is also you have the ability to adjust the specular highlights here. So you can kind of go in and you might notice this maybe a little bit on the background. So if we're dropping the threshold, for example, you can kind of see what's going on there. It's really, really blurifying the background to some degree. I haven't really noticed a time when you're really going to do this outside of, in particular, sort of nighttime renders. Pretty happy with leaving these just at some sort of bog standard average. And the reason for that is we are going to manually tweak a little bit more of this. So really just what length of distortion do you want in the background? And how much noise then finally do you want to add to the shot? But again, I would rather do noise in camera raw. I think you get a bit more control that way. But overall, here we go. We've got our layer mask being used as a lens blur. I'm going to click OK. And then the last thing you want to do here is just looking at the two. And I'm going to drop the opacity of this fella down a little bit. It's lovely, but I think it's probably a little bit too strong. All right. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. Really hope that this explains some of the render passes that you can get out of software like D5. Now, one last thing to mention at the very end. Other software like Lumion has slightly different render passes. And to the best of my knowledge right now, Twinmotion does not have any, which is hopefully something that they work on in the future. You can fake it in Twinmotion by just applying lots of the same material to your entire scene. But overall speaking, for really good render passes that are so very fast to actually render out, D5 is the way to go. All right. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video. Cheers.